How in the world could a place like this, because for some unknown reason, people think you have to have parking in order to fill seats. Well, in some churches. But when God shows up, see, because I want to believe, there's something about me. I like to shop. Anybody, any men in the house? And there's something about a good sale that will allow me to park miles away and walk a long ways to the mall, because there's something that I'm going to get inside the mall. Therefore, I can believe inside of a church. And you say, why are you saying all of that? Because of this reason. Because God knew. And He set us up to be in that place. When my daddy moved that church there in 1969, it is the actual last physical church building in the center of downtown Calgary to ever be purchased in the last 43 years. People have come and gone trying to plant churches in the downtown core, but they will never come into the downtown core and stay for any length of time, because once they grow to a certain size and they need to put some bigger buildings on a site, they can't afford a piece of property like mine. I would predict in this place, and not to brag about anything, but my property is probably the most expensive and the smallest of any of represented in this place. But God is doing something, because He enables us to be in that place, because He says, John, if you will just expand the premise of your thinking. If I think about my particular property, I cannot go this way. But there's one interesting thing about being in the downtown of a city, and that is that if you're on the outskirts, if you're on La Jamodia, you could probably build 1 or 2 or 3 stories, but when you're in the center of a city, you can go as high as you need to go as long as the property will contain it, because you own the air rights of that property. So 25,000 is just big enough to build 22 stories. So somebody says your property's not big enough. I say, oh, yes, it is. We're just going to stack them one after another. What's the premise of your life? What's the premise of your ministry? What are the assumptions that you bring to your daily time before God? See, God is saying to Israel, He is saying, I cannot touch your tent because I first have to touch the place where your tent is going to be built. So God, tonight, on this last night, and thanks for coming. I know half of you, if you could have got a Justin Bieber ticket, you would have been there. I couldn't figure out why all the 12-year-old girls were coming to the hotel this afternoon. But God was saying to Israel, He's saying, I cannot touch your tent and grow your tent until the premise on which your tent will be erected has been expanded. And when the premise of where our tent is to be expanded comes into focus, it brings us to recognize 2 things. That the expansion of the land of my life is actually a point of reference for my life, because it's where I locate myself. It's the place that we call our place. In every debate the other night, as we got off the plane on Tuesday night, I looked up at the screen and there was Governor Romney and the President of the United States in a debate. They both came to that debate with separate premises, and when they started debating their premise, you could see their points of reference, and you could see where they differed in their point of reference. And in our life, our point of reference, when it locates us, positions us to look at our future. And so if my premise is my point of reference, that is where I begin from. And so God is saying to Isaiah, and He's saying to us, tell the people that they are limited. But the problem, I'm going to mess with some of your theology. The problem is not the enemy. The problem in my life, in most of my life, has not been the devil. I have dislocated myself and positioned myself to not take responsibility for myself by blaming it upon the enemy. But when I recognize that my problem is oftentimes not the enemy, and I'm not discounting any of that, but more often than not, my problem is not the enemy. The problem that I have is the place or the premise on which I am building my life. on which I'm building my family, on which I'm building the ministry that God has given. And secondly, Isaiah begins to expand here by saying the premise of your life determines the proportions and the dimensions of the space that you will function in. If I continue to function in a past mindset of always walking in the shadow of someone else, I will not experience the fullness of becoming all that God has for me. So I'm asking myself tonight, and I'm asking you on this last night of this convention of 2012, what is the square footage of your faith that you are choosing on this night to operate in? Are you declaring large faith, but your mind is small-minded? Are you declaring great things from God, but you don't believe that great things are yours to experience? So when I find a problem in my life, I have to ask myself, what is the square footage, what is the dimensions, the proportions that I have placed around my life when I'm having a problem? Do I believe that I am more than enough because He is more than enough to see that problem overcome and work through? Or do I believe it is my lot to continually operate in problems? I talked to a pastor not too long ago, and he was just coming into retirement. He's coming into about 70 or thereabout years, and he told me that he's pastored about 19 churches. I asked him how in the world has he ever accomplished being able to pastor 19 churches. He said, I just made the people mad enough about every 2 to 3 years, so then it was my time to go to the next place. I said, why wouldn't you stick it through? I'm inquiring. I want to know the dimension that he's operating in. And he said to me, he said, John, I hate to fight. I like it when it's nice. And so when they don't know me, then everything's okay and I can stay in that place. But when they get to know me, then they start to bicker and banter, and I don't want to bicker and banter, so I just go to the next place. Thank God for denominations with lots of empty churches so that you can continue to bicker and banter and go to the next place. But it's good for us to expand the horizons of our life and to recognize that God has something beyond just what we believe that we are. If somebody can grab a hold of it tonight and recognize and ask the question, what are the dimensions of my life? What are the limitations I have placed upon myself? God is saying to you tonight, when you determine and you locate yourself based upon the premise of your life, God is saying at that point, that is the place that I would like you to begin to enlarge the place. Because long before He talks about the tent, He talks about the place. I talk to lots of preachers who want big churches, but the place will never contain masses amount of people because they don't believe that it is their opportunity to serve the people of God. See, the tent that we place upon our premise represents three things. Number one, the tent of my life is the system and the mechanism that I use in order to get things done. It's the processes that I have developed in my life. Secondly, a tent is a structure, an object built that is according to a plan. And thirdly, a tent is a substance, a solid or a material reality. So God is saying to us tonight, He's saying, I am going to change your structure. I'm going to change your system. I'm going to change the substance of your life. But before I change any of those things, I have to change the premise on which you will build upon. God doesn't change the premise unless we cooperate with that. But it's only when the premise of our life is changed that there can come an enlargement to the structure that is placed upon that premise. Now imagine just for a minute, I'm going to quit in a second. I don't know how long a second is. Imagine the tent as the structure that you have built. It might be your marriage. It could be your ministry or your church. And there's something about that structure that you've built that you're not happy with. Things need to be changed. It's not growing, it's limited. But you go about doing business the same old way as you did it yesterday. Your premise has not changed, and you're hoping that somehow there will be a miracle. I'm a neglectful husband, say. My wife will tell you different. But oftentimes, the premise of my life is that someone else has to change, and I go to God in prayer in that manner, and I begin to pray, God, would you change my wife? All the while nothing happens, and then I have this distinct sense that God is not hearing my prayers, and I wonder what that is all about, when in actuality He is hearing my prayers. He would just like to enlarge the place, the premise by which I live, and at that moment in time, He would like me to change long before the people around me change. Many people in church, oh God, pastors, would you please kill this one? Would you strike that one? Would you take that one? Would you? And we want everyone else to change around us rather than see an enlargement of the premise, because we would like the structure to be different than it always has been. And God says to these people, He says, I want the barren to be fruitful. But in order for the barren to be fruitful, there has to be an enlargement of the place.